Hey everybody, John Gallo here with the American Oil and Gas Alliance. We're standing on the banks of the Oil Creek, where in 1859 Edwin Drake made history by drilling the first commercial well in the United States. Right here is where it all started for the industry. We're standing here with Sarah on the banks of the Oil Creek at the Drake Well Museum and Park. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about why we're here?
We're here because it was along this creek that the oil industry actually started. This is the reason Colonel Drake came here in 1859 and drilled to discover oil in mass quantities. Because of the creek being called Oil Creek, it was known that oil was in this region. The oil simply floated on top of the water here in this area. When European settlers came to this area, they discovered Native Americans standing in the creek skimming oil off of the water. They found this a little bit peculiar and started to figure out what the Native Americans were doing. The Native Americans were using the oil for medicine, waterproofing, and many other things. European settlers in this area, when they arrived, started doing the same thing, gathering the oil by skimming it and also cribbing it, and gathering it in the oil pits that are here on our property today. This is why in the 1850s, Edwin Drake came here to this area, because it was known to be an area where oil could be collected. And his goal was to figure out how to collect that oil in mass quantities to replace the whale oil that was going into extinction. Native Americans used natural depressions in the earth and also dug natural depressions where oil seeped up out of the ground. They lined the depressions or the holes in the ground with wood to help gather the groundwater that came up, and the groundwater pushed the oil up into this cribbing. Then Europeans adapted this process and actually created chutes so that once the oil rose to the surface of the cribbed pit, it would flow down the chute into a barrel. Hi, my name is Sarah Goodman. I'm the museum educator here at Drake Well Museum and Park. Behind me is a board-for-board replica of the engine house and derrick used by Colonel Edwin L. Drake August 27, 1859 to strike oil at a depth of 69.5 feet. Although the building is a replica, the well itself is a National Historic Landmark, and the well was in production for 2 years. The well produced 20 barrels a day, and the barrels were worth $20 a barrel. Although the well only produced for 2 years, it was instantly recognized as an historic landmark and has always been dedicated as a historic landmark. With a casing pipe and platform floor left there, then a monument built next to the well to dedicate it, and then finally in 1945, a reproduction of the original engine house and derrick used by Colonel Drake. It was at this location that Colonel Drake discovered that you could drill for oil just like the salt wells were being drilled down in Tarentum, Pennsylvania. There were many trials and errors with drilling, but fortunately Colonel Drake persevered, and along with the help of William Smith, was able to strike that oil at 69.5 feet. It started an industry. Now the world had enough crude oil to refine into kerosene to light their homes and replace the oil from the whales that had become so expensive and almost extinct.
So you mentioned something earlier about, before they were able to produce oil economically, that the big resource that was used was whale oil. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important that this was successful?
So before the 1859 oil strike here at Drake Well, the world was using whale oil to light their homes. We need light to function in life. And of course you can use candles and things like that. You can use animal fats, but whale oil was a clean burning fuel. Unfortunately though, by the 1850s, we were hunting whales almost into extinction. You can't simply sail your ship up to a whale and ask for 5 gallons of oil. Of course you have to kill the whale. And it became harder and harder for ships to find the whales, and that drove the price up so that the average family couldn't afford to light their homes. And there had been some experimentation going on with crude oil, and a gentleman by the name of Samuel Keir figured out that you could take crude oil and refine it or process it into a clean burning fuel called kerosene. But the problem was we were not gathering oil in large quantities. It takes a large quantity of crude oil to produce a little bit of kerosene. And so what we ended up having to do is figure out how now to get oil in mass quantities. And that's where Colonel Drake stepped in. It was figuring out that you could drill for the oil and pump it up out of the ground quicker than just simply cribbing it and doing other methods to gather the oil. So the Drake well really helped in the situation of being able to allow the average person to be able to light their home. And of course, then we ran with it and all of a sudden turned oil into many other different things in our life.
And right now I'm standing in front of an exact replica of the original engine that struck oil in 1859 on the Drake well. So we're just a few feet from the original hole. What we're going to be doing is talking about this with our friend Jonathan from the museum, and he's going to give us a little bit of information about what this actually does.
Hello, my name is John Hetrick, and I am the replica operator out here at Drake Well. What that means is I either come in here, I can be stoking the fire to run the boiler first thing in the morning. Once I get pressure, I'm oiling the engine, I'm running the engine, as well as I might go start the gas engine we have on the property as well. My main job out here is running this engine, keeping this engine running smooth. This is our Liddell Marsh & Hershey engine. It is based on plans from that company, Liddell Marsh & Hershey, who was the company rather, who made Drake's engine. We were able to have this engine made because we actually tracked down the lineage of that company. At one point, they were a part of Erie City Iron Works, which actually ended up as a part of Zurn Industries up in Erie, with Zurn making lots of metal castings for sink faucets, floor drains, valves for like toilets and public restrooms, castings like that. We actually found the plans for this engine in their archives in the 80s when we were doing a research project. They were kind enough to do some of these castings, and we have this engine you see here. It is a live steam engine. As I said, I stoke the boiler. In this engine house we have here, it is about as close as we can get to having Drake's original engine and building without having those pieces of history. The building is based on plans that we had drawn up by an architect in the 1940s. We had those made. We have photographs taken by John Mathers, who was an early oil field photographer. He took a lot of pictures of goings-on, wells being drilled, some of the fires in the area, as well as lots of the boom towns in the area. And from those photographs, we were able to have that architect kind of take measurements off things like people's hats, things we did know the measurements of. We had those plans drawn up to build this building with every board in this building corresponding in size and location to a board on that original building, making this a board-accurate replica. Our building here is made using square-cut nails, blacksmith handmade nails. The windows are made using period techniques. The hinges are all blacksmithed. The only things in this building that aren't historically accurate are the lighting, the safety rails, and then the locks on the doors. So we have here our replica of our Liddell Marsh & Hershey steam engine. This being a live steam engine has all of the components and pieces you would need to have on an engine for it to run. We have our steam tube right here. It's what first allows the steam to enter into the engine from the boiler behind me. We have our main valve here, which turns on the steam. It's more like a light switch. We have our secondary valve here, which I'll get to in a second. We have our steam chest, which is where there is a sliding valve with holes drilled in it. The sliding valve will slide back and forth, and that is what can actually introduce steam above or below the piston because this is actually a dual action engine. With steam engines, just because of their anatomy, you can actually seal below the piston and inject steam to force the piston back up to what we would consider top dead center. So you can get every stroke in a steam engine to be a power stroke. This is the cylinder, the long section here, and you can see there's two sections where you would either, again, have steam above or below. The piston inside is flat and round like a pancake, so you can have that steam on each end. Coming down a little bit more, we have our flyball governor. The governor is going to be what maintains our operating speed in the engine. As the governor spins up, as the engine starts to spin faster and faster and faster after I've turned on the main valve, the governor actuates the weights fly out, they start to lift and lift and lift at full actuation, which you can see would be right here. You can see the secondary valve right here. It's a butterfly valve in line of the steam. And what the governor does is closes that, closes that, closes that until you get up to operating speed, at which point there's only enough steam flowing through to keep the engine just running at speed. Now, if the engine were to slow down from that speed, obviously the governor, weights drop a little, valve opens back up, more steam enters, engine speeds back up, and it's a constant feedback loop trying to maintain that operating speed. This is our engine and our engine house. That is the replica of the engine house that Drake and Billy Smith had originally used to drill that first oil well that kick-started the oil industry. Uncle Billy was a salt well driller, colloquially, referred to Uncle Billy by his friends and people he knew. Was a salt well driller down in Trenton, Pennsylvania. And Drake knew that the salt well drillers, every once in a while, they might start a well after a long rain or after it had been sitting a while, and they might get this foul-smelling black liquid up out of the ground in their well, would ruin their batch of salt. The salt was wanted so they could evaporate, brine rather, was wanted so they could evaporate the water out of it to get use of that salt for curing meats, pickling. That was your refrigerator in the day. There was no ice unless you were extremely wealthy. So Drake knew the oil was in the ground, and he knew that salt well drillers were getting it by accident. So what his thought process was, well, hey, if I drill in a spot where I know there's a lot of oil, and I get a salt well driller to do that for me, I'll probably strike oil. And that's exactly what he did. He went down to Tarentum. He hired Billy Smith. He hired a few other drillers beforehand. He got cheated out of some money a couple times just because he would hire a guy, no one showed up, hire a guy, no one showed up, or he would even have trouble finding anyone to show up. But Billy Smith actually took a liking to Drake just for his sheer determination, and he was like, you know what, I'll come drill your well for you. So Drake had the engine. He bought the engine used. It's a Liddell Marsh & Hershey engine, and had Billy Smith come up, and he was the driller. So what that means is he was down at the hole most of the time. He usually had his hand on the temper screw, which is a part that lowers the bit slowly, 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 is hand cranked. After you do 2 or 3 strikes of the bit, you crank it a little bit, 2 or 3 strikes, crank it a little bit. Uncle Billy was really good at that, and that was a very important thing to be good at, because you're drilling with a chisel, can wander off one way, wander off another way. The other trick Uncle Billy had up his sleeve was he was a fisher. What that means is sometimes when you're drilling, you're doing this, you're doing that, you might lose a bit, something might fall in the hole, and you need to get that up out of the hole. Well, Uncle Billy knew how to get, a cast iron piece of metal way up out of the hole, 400, 500 feet down. He made his own tools. He was a blacksmith, so he could sharpen the bits as well. And Drake really was the supervisor in all of this. He was the financial body in that he was the one spending Seneca Oil Company's money. He was the one who bought the engine, who leased the land, who contracted to have the building put up, paid the drillers, paid for all of the components and tooling, paid for the piping, as well as he was a problem solver. When they were drilling their well, the problem here is the water table is so high in this area that as you're drilling a hole in the ground, immediately that hole starts filling up with water. And the problem that Uncle Billy was having was he's drilling. Well, after getting, a foot down, 2 foot down, 3 foot down, you can't see the hole anymore. You can't see what you're drilling. You can't see what's going on, as well as the hole starts to fall in because of the saturation. Drake's idea was to pound casing first, drive casing into the ground, then drill through that casing. This is the first time it had been done. Up until that point, the methodology was you drilled your hole, you drove your casing, you kept drilling. But in this area, you really had that necessity of having the casing in the ground first. And that was where Drake came into play. Drake was a very prominent problem solver, was also part of the reason he was brought in to work on this. And that really saved the well. And at that point, they started drilling. Took them about 2 weeks. and then they had a bit slip on a Saturday. And they figured, okay, it's the end of the day, we'll leave it for Monday. And Uncle Billy actually had a house he was staying in with his family, was just over across the lawn. He came by with his son. They were going fishing probably in the creek. Came by just to check things out, make sure everything was where they left it. And they looked in the hole, and sure enough, there was a bit of a glint in the hole. And they had struck oil, they just hadn't realized it. So at that point, you have to lower your tube in, and you will begin pumping the oil unless it's a flowing well. Some of the wells in the area were flowing wells, and the well here produced anywhere from 12 to 15 barrels a day. Great to start out with, not necessarily a high producing well once other wells had come into the area, with some of the ones in Pit Hole per se producing 1,500 barrels a day. When I have steam, it's really as simple as turning on the light switch. Now there is some water in it now, since it's the first run, so it might take a second, but once I get that water cleared out, nothing. No problem at all. You can see there is some dark color in the water. That could be a little bit of corrosion, but it's most likely the steam oil that is put into this. You drip a little bit of a very, very heavy oil into the engine as you're running the steam through it. And what that does, the heat of the steam will cause that oil to become less and less and less viscous and eventually flow very, very easily. And then it lubricates the inside of the cylinder, it lubricates the steam chest, as well as inhibiting rust. And once the water starts to clear out here, you'll start to hear what the engine really sounds like. As it starts to run, you'll really start to hear, this is about what it sounds like. It doesn't get much louder than this. And it's a really neat thing that an engine like this can run so quietly. But you can see all the actuation going on over in this area, the connecting rod and the push rod into the steam chest. I do know that by the time you really got to Pit Hole, you started to see, pretty much all year round. As long as you could keep that heat in the boiler and keep the water in the boiler from freezing, you would really have those engines running as long as you could get wood for them. And I say pumping because here we are set up for pumping. But you would have also used this engine set up for drilling as well. You would just change out the sucker rod on the end for a string of tools that's breaking through that rock rather than lifting that oil up out of the ground.
Hey everybody, John Gallo with American Oil and Gas Lines here. Hey, I just want to take a minute to thank our friends Michael, Sarah, and John for letting us be a part of this here at the Drake Well Museum and Park. We got tons of footage today. We got more to come. Something tells me it's time to go to work.